In our previous videos, we've been looking at value chain and ways to improve the value chain. So we talked about quality assurance, preventing defects before they happen. And we talked about lean manufacturing or lean Six Sigma or just in time, where we look at eliminating waste in terms of overproduction, in terms of inefficiencies, in terms of too much inventory. So we want to take that and expand that, not just to the parts of our internal process, but we want to then expand that to look at the entire supply chain. So when we talk about the supply chain, we're talking about the other organizations outside of our company who are involved anywhere from making a product or making parts that go into our product, the suppliers, the manufacturers, the factory, the distributors, the wholesalers, the retailers, all the way to get to the end customer. If we want to be more efficient and effective, we can't do that only within our organization. We need the entire supply chain to be more efficient and effective. So we talk about competitive advantage, when we talk about strategies for our organization, we talked about cost leadership, we talked about differentiation. If you're going to be pursuing these strategies for your organization, or if these are going to be your competitive advantages, then it has to go throughout the entire supply chain. So if you want to be more efficient, we have to look at reducing costs throughout the chain. If you're going to be more effective, then we have to look at improving quality and timeliness throughout the chain. So we want an effective supply chain. We want to reduce the cost of making purchases. We want to reduce the cost of transportation. We want to reduce the cost in terms of production or manufacturing. We want to go quicker to the market. So we want to move very quickly from suppliers to manufacturing all the way to the customer. So the time to market is reduced. And we want to reduce our inventory costs. So we want to work with our supply chain to reduce the risk, to look at where we're storing our inventory, to help in terms of not having too much inventory that is sitting in storage and losing value. And we want it to move seamlessly through the process. So this is where we see that lean manufacturing just in time, is that the entire supply chain then is involved in helping to eliminate these wastes, being more efficient, lowering the amount of inventory, getting it just when you need it. We want our supply chain to improve product quality. So again, that's the entire supply chain that's involved in it. And we want to improve the design of our products. So all the members of our supply chain are going to be part of determining really what our product is, what it can do. And so the supply chain together, that is going to determine whether or not we can improve the product design. So let's think about then, what are the characteristics of an effective supplier? So if you are the management in terms of Tim Hortons, you're looking for a supplier. What is it you are looking for in terms of the supplier? We've learned from Deming that we probably don't want to just choose the cheapest supplier because we know if we focus just solely on cost cutting, quality goes down and costs will actually go up. So we want to consider a cost-effective supplier, but maybe not the cheapest. Right? We probably want a supplier who is timely, who gets us the materials that we need. If we think about companies like Subway, for example, Subway has its vegetables delivered once a week. Well, it's pretty tight once you get to that last day of the week because a number of those vegetables don't have a really long shelf life. And so by the last day of the week, they're not super fresh. And so they're very dependent on that supplier getting those materials in just in time when they need them. So we need a reliable supplier. We need someone who's probably also flexible. So if we decide we need more materials, they can accommodate. So if we look at our suppliers, when we're choosing a supplier, we want someone who also has that same level of quality or same focus on quality that we have. We want quality assurance, right? Preventing the defects before they happen. Somebody who's flexible, who's responsible. We probably want someone who is in a good location. What we're seeing more and more during COVID is a movement towards nearshoring. So nearshoring is where you are choosing suppliers that are closer geographically. So one of the impacts of COVID and these long global supply chains is that when there are disruptions in other countries, so if you are producing an iPhone in China and there is a COVID outbreak there, then that means that you can't get your supplies. Maybe there are border restrictions to help keep out COVID. This caused issue in terms of getting supplies. Then we think about the fact that many products have to move across the globe on plane, on train, on ship. Well, the challenge with COVID is that, in a tight space with some same people, you're more likely to have an outbreak and all the people get sick. So it's harder to move materials globally when you have outbreaks in terms of ships that aren't able to move because of quarantines, because of COVID cases. And there are now less people who are able to do the trucking of the materials. And so it's very difficult to get what you ordered from your suppliers when you had this global supply chain. So one thing we are seeing as a result of COVID is people are looking for suppliers who are closer geographically. And that is, they don't have to travel as far. Their supplies don't have to travel as far to get them and might be less likely to be disrupted by issues in terms of border issues that we've seen through the pandemic. So we're seeing more of what is called nearshoring, having suppliers that are more close to you geographically. So we're choosing based on location, we'll choose based on price, we'll choose based on reputation. Are they able to meet our needs? Are they going to be around in a year or two and we still need them? What is their reputation in terms of how they treat their employees? So in the news lately, we've seen with Apple and some of the suppliers in China who have been making iPhones that there's been poor working conditions. People are quite unhappy who work for the factories, and people are just quitting. And this, when Apple's Supplier, which is, a company that most people don't know the name of, when there's an issue there in terms of how the employees are treated, the working conditions, the pay, what happens is there's blowback, it falls out on Apple, right? So Apple's reputation is impacted by the reputation of their suppliers. And we've seen that with other companies when we talk about like sweatshops for clothing and for shoe manufacturers. So the reputation of your suppliers matters. Lead time matters. How long between when you order your product and when it arrives? We need our suppliers to be responsive. The challenge is the longer it takes between when you place the order and when it arrives, the more you start to panic that you don't have enough or you might not have enough to meet your customer's demand. And so then you order a lot more. And so now you have all this excess inventory that has to be stored, that loses value. We have then as we're talking about previously in terms of waste, that adds to your waste, adds to your costs, and makes you less lean. You got to consider the other customers. So if we look at, for example, McDonald's used to have Heinz ketchup. They no longer have Heinz ketchup because Burger King bought Heinz. So we have to take into consideration as we're looking for our supplier, that supplier, we're probably going to share a lot of information with them. They're going to know how much of your McDonald's, how many fries we sell, how we move, how much inventory we move, how many customers we're seeing. And that's a lot of information we're sharing. So you want a supplier that you can trust. And so the concern, of course, is that what if that supplier leaves and goes and works for your competition? And in the case of Heinz ketchup, what if your supplier is the competition? So Burger King owns Heinz. That means that McDonald's is basically paying their rival for supplies. And so there are concerns there in terms of information, your competitors knowing trade secrets about your organization. We also have to look at service after the sale. So what if we need to return things? What if there are quality issues? Will they take them back? If we look at Amazon, for example, if you buy something on Amazon and you go to return it, it is the supplier who is actually the one who is going to cover the cost of the return. So perhaps you've seen when you've ordered something from Amazon where the supplier has said, well, you just keep it. We'll refund you the money, but you just keep the product, because they're the ones who essentially have to pay Amazon for it to be shipped back to them. And they don't want to incur that extra cost. It's just not worth it. And then we have to look at, well, Amazon doesn't want these items either. So what do? So what we see is that there are companies popping up, and we have one called Crazy Bins. And this is a third party who buys the returns off of Amazon and then sells them themselves. And that way Amazon doesn't have to worry about, how do we get this inventory that's been returned back into our inventory system to resell it to someone else. We don't have to worry about if it's out of date, and we can then outsource to other people in terms of checking what the issue is with it. So when we look at suppliers, we look at service after the sale. Who's going to handle the returns? Who's going to cover those costs that are associated with it? You might also choose a supplier based on certifications. So if you are involved in a supply chain that relates to food processing, so whether you are one that helps process meat, beef, or you make, spices that are packaged and sold, then you would look for partners who have certifications. And one of those is HACCP. This is the hazard analysis. Yep, I got too many A's here. HACCP, hazard analysis, critical control. And then, so this certification then has to deal with food safety. And so you're choosing your suppliers or your distributors who also have that certification, so that any food that you're purchasing from your suppliers, has been kept and stored in ways that will not create foodborne illnesses for your customer base. So you may look for certain types of certifications, and HACCP is one that is based on food and looks at things like allergens and chemicals and pesticides in the food processing approach. You need to think about the length of the contract with your supplier. Is it short or is it long term? If we look at choosing a supplier and we look at Toyota, for example, so Toyota has what they call the Toyota production system. So when Toyota chooses suppliers, they're in it for the long haul. They're looking for suppliers who want to partner with them for more than a decade, 10, 15 years or more. And the idea is that you partner with the supplier would even move to be located at the same location as your manufacturing plant, and you work very closely together. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. There's learning from each other. And so we get from that the Japanese word kiritsu, which means long-term reliance. The idea here is you pick a supplier is one that is an effective and mutually beneficial relationship. So we don't want one where our organization is highly dependent on the supplier, and the supplier has lots of customers, so they have very little dependence on us, in which case we're essentially held hostage by our supplier. Alternatively, if our supplier has high dependence, so maybe we're their only customer, but we are low dependence because we have other companies that we buy from, then that causes us to be drunk with power. So it's really about leverage. And if it's going to be a mutually beneficial relationship, you need to have high dependence from both parties. That way, there is a benefit of mutual learning and a close relationship. And so Kiritsu is a long-term alliance. So you may choose, as you set up your contracts, to have those long-term alliances like you see with the Toyota production system. Alternatively, you may have short-term contracts where you have lots of suppliers who are bidding against each other to be the one who provides to you. So you got to decide how many suppliers you're going to have. Are you going to have one, like the Toyota production system, where they essentially move on to your production campus with you for the long term? Or are you going to have lots of suppliers? So are you going to put it out for a competitive bid? Maybe you're going to have a supplier who is involved with you in terms of before you even start to manufacture your product. So pre-sourcing is where you choose suppliers during the concept development stage, and your supplier then is going to be involved in the actual product design and creation of those process flows. So they're going to be in it from the very beginning, and so there you're going to have a much more tight relationship, and you're then less likely to have multiple suppliers. What you see on the right is a chart that comes from the Harvard Business Review that looks at Chrysler. And so Chrysler had a system where they had a number of suppliers and competitive bids, and really they chose their suppliers based on the lowest prices. Then they had systems where they had a much more relational where it was much more relation-based in terms of the supplier, much more like the Toyota production system in terms of that collaborative process. And so if you compare 1989 to 1994, what they saw is a great improvement in terms of their production processes, their performance, and they had those long-term cooperative agreements. So you might choose to have a close relationship with your supplier. Are you going to have a single supplier? Are you going to have multiple ones? Is it going to be a long-term relationship? So Keiretsu. Maybe in order to have a really close relationship with your suppliers and truly share all information, you may decide to have vertical integration. That is, you may decide to own parts of the supply chain. And in a previous video, we talked about forward and backwards integration. So are you taking over your distributor? Are you taking over your supplier? So you need to decide what's the closeness of that relationship. What level of information sharing are you going to have? What level of visibility will they have into your company's operations and processes? Will you work together to forecast demand, to plan in terms of we talked about pre-sourcing in terms of that design. Maybe you're going to have an agreement with your supplier in terms of replenishment. So for example, at the grocery store, if you have been to a grocery store around central Alberta, what you'll notice is that Coca-Cola and Pepsi actually pay people to restock the shelves. It's not the co-op or the Save-On that is restocking the Coke and Pepsi supply. It's actually people from Pepsi and Coke who do that. So we have vendor managed inventory where the supplier is the one who keeps track of how much inventory is on the grocery store shelf and is responsible for restocking. So then there's a level of visibility where these suppliers can see how much is available on the shelves. And you can go further and have a level of visibility where you have software where the suppliers can actually see what's happening in terms of your sales trends and can see what's happening in terms of the inventory that you have in your system. We also look at the level of communication. So how much are you communicating? What form are you communicating in? Are you using software to share information? Is this an order form that's being sent? How much visibility is there? And then when you're choosing a supplier, we want to look at event management. So event management is how well your overall chain, the whole supply chain, responds to unplanned events. So if there's a unique issue, for example, supply chain disruptions because there's not enough truckers or there's not enough shipping containers, and so items can't get moved across the ocean, how well does your overall supply chain deal with that unplanned or unique event? So not just one company within the supply chain, but how responsive is that whole supply chain to something that's unplanned? How well does the partners in the supply chain work together? And then we can create performance metrics. So we have those key performance indicators, and we can look at what is happening in terms of cost, what is happening in terms of quality, what is happening in terms of timeliness. So what is the lead time between when we order and when it arrives? What's happening in terms of customer satisfaction? How flexible are the members of our supply chain in terms of being able to respond to changes in demand? And we go back to some of the calculations we did when we talked about financial management in terms of inventory turnover. So our inventory tends to sit for how long with us? So if you think about a car dealership, how long does the car sit on the lot? How long does a can of soup sit at the grocery store before it goes out the door? And then days of supply, which is related to that inventory turnover calculation. The last one we might look at is what is called a fill rate, which is what percentage of the time are we able to give the customer what they want right when they come in and look for it? Do we have it on hand? Are we able to fill their order? So as we're choosing a supplier, there's a number of things we consider, right? We talked about the closeness of our relationship, and is it a mutual beneficial relationship as opposed to one having leverage over the other? We talked about how we need that communication and information sharing, and one way to increase that communication or information sharing is through vertical integration, and that's where a company takes control over one or more parts of the supply chain. This is going to help us in terms of cost reduction because we actually control the parts of the supply chain, so we can focus on efficiencies. And if we are going to have more of a differentiation strategy, then allows us to increase that differentiation because we can work very closely with our own company to improve quality. So while if you want to have differentiation or cost leadership strategies, you need to work on that throughout the entire supply chain. Sometimes it's easier to do this if it's your own company because you don't have to worry about is there a risk in sharing the information, and you don't have to worry about that other companies do things differently than you and have different organizational cultures than you. Instead, you are able to dictate to the entire process how things are done. So backward integration is where you take over the supplier. Forward integration, you take over your distributor. We want to differentiate this from horizontal integration. Horizontal integration is where you take over the competition. So if we purchase our competitor or we merge with the competition, we have horizontal integration. Now, this can help in terms of our cost leadership because it allows us to be a bigger organization. And we talked about in previous videos, what do we call that? When you get bigger and bigger, so your cost per unit falls as your quantity increases. What do we call that? We call that economies of scale. And so one of the reasons to take over the competition or horizontal integration is to help achieve those economies of scale. At the time we're making this video, we are seeing Rogers and Shaw try to do horizontal integration. That is, they want to merge. This helps the companies grow in size, bring in more revenue. This can help in terms of expanding into new markets. So if Shaw is in an area that Rogers is not, then that allows Rogers to move into those markets. And you can take advantage of more efficient processes and technology and know-how that the competitor has to diversify your product offerings. And so we look at Rogers and Shaw, it would allow them then to provide more product offerings, not just in terms of cable TV, but in terms of cell phone service and other telecommunications products. And of course, the benefit is it reduces the competition. So that means that you have less competitors for your organization. And then we know less competition keeps the price from falling. Now, of course, horizontal integration tends to be subject to antitrust laws. In the US, they have the Sherman Antitrust Act. In Canada, we have the Competition Act. Under both countries, we use what is called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index to determine if there's too much concentration in the market. And so when we look at mergers like Rogers and Shaw, then what they determine is if the two merge, does that mean that there is a lot less competition? And so there are benchmarks when it comes to the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index to kind of flag what might be anti-competitive behavior or antitrust behavior, where the government might want to say, nope, you're not allowed to have horizontal integration. When it comes to the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, I'm just going to erase this here. If we look at a monopoly, in a monopoly, there is one company that has 100% of the market share. So we take 100 and we square it. And if you take 100 and you square it, right, so we pull open our calculator here. Right, 100 and squared is 10,000. So the biggest your Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or HHI, can be is 10,000. In comparison, if you have 100 highly competitive firms, so let's say that each of these 100 firms has 1% of the market share, then we take 1 squared, which is 1, and we multiply that times 100. So you can see here, if we have 100 firms, 100 companies that each have 1% of the market share, then the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index number is 100. Well, when it comes to the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index numbers and whether or not we allow for horizontal integration, when there is a Herfindahl-Hirschman number above about 1,800, this is considered to be a market that is highly concentrated. So if we already have a market that's highly concentrated, and then there's a proposal for a merger, and that merger would cause the HHI to go up by more than 100 points, then that is considered to be anti-competitive behavior. And in both the US and Canada, we can say, oh, not allowed. You're not allowed to merge. So we have in Canada the Competition Bureau, and they get to look at and have a say into whether or not these mergers are allowed. And so what we're seeing with Rogers and Shaw is they're already a highly concentrated market. Them merging would cause the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index to go up by more than 100 points. And at the time we're making this video, the Competition Bureau has already said that they recommend against allowing these two companies to merge, and it seems like the government is not going to allow them to go forward. So as we're looking at suppliers, we need to decide how close of a relationship are we going to have? Are we going to have multiple suppliers or one? Is it going to be a long-term relationship? Maybe it's just better that we have the relationship with ourselves and we have integration. How much information sharing? What kind of communication? And how are we going to measure the effectiveness of our supply chain? We may decide as we look at our supply chain that we are going to just do insourcing. So we are going to use our organization's own personnel and resources to accomplish tasks. So it's going to be us, not another company. Alternatively, we could outsource. So we could hire another company, a party outside of our company, to perform part of that value chain process. It could be that we are choosing, in terms of our process design and production, we are going to have someone produce part of the product. So if you're making vehicles, for example, you might have someone else make the engine. You might have somebody else make the tires, and you're doing the assembly. You can also outsource the logistics. That is, who's going to move your products from the manufacturing plant where you make the vehicle to the car dealership. You can also outsource the planning itself of the movement of the materials. So there are companies that will actually do the planning portion. So you can have other companies, FedEx, DHL, move the material. You can outsource your IT. You can outsource parts of the manufacturing process. As you are choosing your supply chain, right, we want to focus on companies that will help us be more efficient and effective. And as we look at our supply chain, we can decide that our supply chain is going to be very short. So we are going to have a direct channel from producer to consumer. We'll make it, we'll sell it directly to the customer ourselves. Alternatively, we can engage other companies in that process. So we could make the product and sell it to a retailer. So maybe we make Christmas cards and there is a local business in the mall who's going to sell it on our behalf, producer to retailer. An indirect channel, but a fairly short supply chain. You could go the other extreme and have quite a long, complicated supply chain. So if we're trying to get into international markets, for example, we might be a clothing manufacturer in Indonesia. We have a broker who's going to help us find other organizations in other countries that are going to help in terms of getting our product to customers. Brokers do not take ownership of goods. They simply help you find partners. And then we might have from there, we might have a distributor. You don't see that on this image here, but between broker and wholesaler, we could add a distributor. And then it could go to a wholesaler. And then it could go to a retailer. So if we're looking at the movement of clothes, for example, somebody might buy the clothes that we manufacture. They would buy it in bulk. And then they would find another company to help distribute it and to get it to the retailer like the Bay to sell it. So there can be quite a number of companies involved in your supply chain, especially if you are trying to get into markets in other countries. So previously we were looking at the value chain and our supply chain. And so we typically think of these as a sequential process. So we have our supplier going to the producer, going to the, as we saw before, right? We have wholesalers, we have retailers, all the way to the customer. So we often think of this as a sequential process. When you're analyzing your value chain, your supply chain, you can instead create what's called a value constellation. And a value constellation shows those same actors, but notice here it's showing that all of those different parties are simultaneously contributing to the value creation process. So rather than thinking about it as the company who provides the materials, who makes the product, who gets it onto a retailer, they do a couple things and their job is done. If we're truly looking at cost leadership or differentiation, then they must be simultaneously and continuously contributing to our value chain and to helping us in terms of our competitive advantage. And so you're seeing more of these value constellation diagrams to show the value added from all of the parts of our value chain or supply chain.